So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to thank the Friends of the Library in particular for their support of these programs. Tonight we have not one, but two amazing authors and gardeners. Paige Dickey is a garden writer, lecturer, and designer. She has written on gardening and garden design over the years for House and Garden, House Beautiful, Horticulture, Elle Décor, Architectural Digest, and the New York Times. She is the author of 8 books, including the award-winning Breaking Ground Portrait of 10 Garden Designers. Her latest book, Uprooted, which is backwards here, A Gardener Reflects on Beginning Again, is about her move north and the subsequent adventure. Paige is on the board of the Garden Conservancy and co-founded the Open Days program in 1995. She is active on social media and lives in Falls Village, Connecticut. Margaret Roach, after spending 15 years with Martha Stewart Living and close to a decade with Newsday and the New York Times, is now the writer of a nationally acclaimed blog, A Way to Garden. Since April 2020, she has been a columnist for the New York Times, where her career began. This is also her book, backwards, but it's also just been reissued as a new copy. Margaret has 3 titles to her credit: A Way to Garden, The Backyard Parables, and I Shall Have Some Peace There, another backwards book. In 2018, Margaret was awarded the highest honor of the nation's oldest horticultural society, Mass Hort, for her contributions to horticulture. We are so lucky to have these 2 talented women share their evening with us. We would like to thank you all for joining us. Remember, all these books will be available at Barrett Books in Darien, Connecticut, and I'm sure they'd love to see you tomorrow. And now I'll turn it over to the ladies and the real evening entertainment. Thank you.
Hi to everybody. Thank you, Kathleen, for that very nice introduction and for having us. So in my woo-woo way of looking at gardening, I call the first, Paige is already laughing at me. Okay, I call the first 2 months of the calendar year, not winter, but the season of conception. And so it's time in January and February to kind of conceive of the garden to come, to plan on paper, to order things, to get ready, but mostly to dream about what we want to have manifest in the year ahead. Heaven's willing, right? So tonight, to leave lots of time for your questions, in case you all are dreaming too and want to bounce some ideas off someone, and that would be us. Rather than a formal lecture style, we're going to have a little bit of a chat and a show and tell with some slides of some projects we each are kind of dreaming about on our 2021 list. And then we're going to leave that time for questions, so you can put them in the chat as we go. Go ahead and put them in there, and we'll look through them afterward, after our informal presentation. So what Paige, Dickey, and I have in common, besides gardening in a similar zone, not far from each other, and both being, as Paige, you would say, a dirt gardener, right?
Yep.
That's what you always call us, dirt gardeners, meaning we have a lot of very dirty fingernails and dirty knees in our pants and dirty boots.
That's right.
And both writing books, we've both written books, is that we each started out decades ago as sort of collector plant types, acquiring unusual and often rare ornamental plants, really based on how pretty they were, right? And what we could do with them in a design. By mail order from far away, chosen really, again, for their looks. And most of these plants were from Asia or Europe. And what else we have in common is that as we've gotten older, we've gradually both veered to a more native obsession. So we find ourselves, I'm going to tell our secret now, Paige, we find ourselves in our golden years nurturing oak seedlings that some squirrel planted and crawling around on the ground trying to key out the different species of native sedges or carex. So Paige, I thought you could begin by just introducing yourself and your place, your new place that's the subject of Uprooted, and some slides. So I'm going to share my screen. It's just going to take me a second to get that going.
I left a garden of 34 years, 6 years ago, and moved up to the northwest corner of Connecticut literally 1/2 hour from where Margaret lives in New York. So we're right on the border of New York and Massachusetts. And we ended up with a place just so different than Duck Hill, which was the place that I had before and where I had a very intensive garden. This is an old church. The right-hand part of this picture is an old church built in 1793. It was the first Methodist church in New England. And we added on a living room because it didn't really have a living room and it didn't have a fireplace. So we added on this bit. And what we loved about, one of the things we loved about this place, this is my husband Bosco and me, was its setting. For one thing, it sits really with fields all around it, and it sits on a kind of plateau. And there's this great sense of sky and space and air. It's quite wonderful. We've cut back on gardens. We have a garden in the front of the house and a garden in back of the house. And maybe, should we do the next slide? This is in front of the house. There was the remains of a garden when we arrived 6 years ago. There's a wall there, you can't see it in this picture. And you see this tree, which is a shad tree, a serviceberry, a melanchier, a tree I adore. It is native. It's one of our great understory trees, beloved by birds. So there are 2 of these in this front garden. And so there was a wall, there were these 2 trees, and there were peonies, because of course peonies live forever. But the rest of it was derelict. And I decided to play with it. And in a very different way, the gardens at Duck Hill were very structured. And I decided I wanted it to be loose and transparent, and I wanted it to connect really to the fields that are really just beyond this driveway. And so I put in things like this, like Veronicastrum and asters and Vernonia and Baptisia and this wonderful spirea called Thunbergii ogon, which just has that divine chartreusey color, which is so important in a garden. Can we have the next slide? And I am using the pointer, okay. And there's that wall I was talking about. One of the things I wanted to do in this front garden, this rather informal and loose front garden, was to attract birds and butterflies. And so here you see Helianthus lemon queen, which the goldfinches love. And here, this purple is ironweed, Vernonia. And can we have the next slide, Margaret? And in August, that ironweed is just dancing with giant black swallowtail butterflies. Our kitchen and our porch are right next to this little garden in front of the house. So we're sitting, we don't even have to be outside. We're sitting inside, the doors are open, the windows are up, and we see this life coming to the garden. Should we have another slide? Well, in back of the house, after we put on that addition, there was sort of a wasteland where the construction happened. And the elevation dropped down from where the new building was. And so we had to put in a retaining wall. And so we did, we being the royal we, a lovely neighbor, built this dry wall, and it's about right here in the front here. It's about 4 feet high. And on the next to the house, we now have a gravel terrace, which I love. But on the other side of that wall, I decided to have a little cutting garden. We had a large cutting vegetable garden at Duck Hill. I think it was about 70 or 80 feet square. And I knew I didn't want that again. Neither of us wanted to have that much work in a vegetable garden. And so this is about 30 feet square, and it's enough to have lettuces and chives and tulips and leeks, and in the summertime, annuals, all for cutting. I have a young man who works for me one day a week, which is just so special. And we have a lot of woods. I'll mention that later. And we have a lot of old cedar, the eastern red cedar, which is really a juniper, in the woods. And so I asked John if one winter, if he could, I drew a picture of some tutors, and I asked him if he could build them, and he did. And he had also put this cedar fence around this garden. And I thought that those tutors gave the garden a little more weight, a little more interest. Do we have another slide there, Margaret?
Mm-hmm.
On the outside of that little garden, I haven't stopped collecting altogether. I don't know if you have, but Margaret, but I haven't.
I suspect you know the answer, Paige.
And one of the things I had lots of it at Duck Hill were roses, was roses. And I'm not going to do that again, but I couldn't not have some roses. And so I planted the whole perimeter of this garden, this cutting garden, with roses, but roses that were kind of wild, that were species roses. I mean, what you see here is what I love called the apple rose. It's Rosa villosa. Sometimes it's called Rosa pomifera. And it has lovely flowers and leaves, but its claim to fame are its hips. They really do look like cherry tomatoes, except bigger. And here is a picture of the cutting garden, or the outside of the cutting garden, in September, with those rose hips, and above it, Helianthus lemon queen, which is a favorite thug of mine. I do love it. So this is really why we bought this place. We had at Duck Hill 3 acres of literally all garden. Every single piece of that 3 acres was cultivated, and it was a lot. It was a lot to take care of. Well, now we have 17 acres, which makes people laugh because it doesn't sound like it's cutting back. But most of it is wild land. I mean, uncultivated land. It's meadows and woods, high rocky woods on the back side of the property, and low, deep, rich woods on the front part of the property. And this, as much as I love the gardens, these wild places have made my heart palpitate. Can we have the next slide? This is just one shot of the low. If you went down the path through that field that you just saw in that last picture, and you would descend and descend and descend, and then you'd be in this rather dark, wonderful, moist, rich woodland. It's calcareous woodland. We're on limestone. And so some of the plants are very different. But down in the deep woods, there are a lot of pines and there's some hemlocks and there's witch hazels and there's some oaks um, and it has, I think it's changed. I think the forest floor down there is a little less sweet than the soil around the house. And so you have all sorts of ferns and jack-in-the-pulpits and rue anemones and star flowers and all sorts of ephemerals. Is it another slide? Well, this is, I told you the house was on a plateau, so you either descend deeply into damp woods, dark woods, and also a little wetland to the side, or you climb up into extraordinary rocky woods. There's some thought that at one time it was a quarry. And it's because it's limestone, it has the most interesting plants that I didn't know until I came here. This carex here is called Carex eburnia, or the bristle-leaf sedge, and it only grows in limestone. And this is a ragwort, but it's not the common one. It's called Pachyra obovata, and its claim to fame is it's the only food for the larvae of the endangered northern metalmark butterfly. So butterfly enthusiasts get really excited about this habitat. So is that the last slide?
I think so, yeah.
All right, you're on, Margaret.
Okay, I'll try to outdo that, but I don't think so. I'm just on 2.3 acres, and as you can see in this picture, I'm a real plants woman, because look at all I have blooming out the window. But seriously, this is what it looks like right today, looking out the back up the hillside behind my house. I'm on a very, very steep site. I'm surrounded by the Taconic State Park in Copiague Falls, New York. So it's 7,000 acres of sort of state forest and parkland, a lot of agricultural lands and so forth. And looking down at that same spot, the backyard of the house from above. And my thing is this sort of idea of a 365-day garden, that I want to be able to look out even in the deepest winter months like right now and see shapes and shadow play and structure and the undulation of the land and so forth, and be happy with that, to get past sort of the big obvious moments of, you know, hydrangea time or whatever. I want to have some beauty, even much more subtle kinds of beauty at all times of year. And you can see there's that water garden in the backyard. Water is really important to me. It turns out it's the most, to me, it's even more than any plant, probably the most diversity supporting element of the garden. And I'm happy that I created 2 in-ground water gardens when I first came to the place about 35 years ago, and they've served me really, really well. And all the animals, every species of frog and toad in our area reproduces in them, 3 species of salamanders. As small as they are, keeping on frozen water 365 days a year means that a lot of life can come out of it. I came from a garden I was making in Queens, in the house I grew up in, when I had been called home to take care of my mother, who was in her late 40s and had early onset Alzheimer's disease. And so I went home there, and I sort of, as self-therapy, was stuck at home a lot, and I did kind of my first gardening experiments. And one of the things I bought, it was smaller at the time than it is now, is this Cyadopetus, this Japanese umbrella pine. And when she finally had to go into nursing care, and I got this place upstate, as I said, about 35 years ago, I packed 2 things from that early experiment in gardening into the moving van. One was this tree. It was only about chest high at the time. And one was some Siberian iris. And both are still with me. I didn't even know what zone I was moving to, so it was really crazy. But I did it, and the tree is very happy, as you can see against the winter light here. When I came, the place it was like a jungle and all overgrown and a complete mess, no garden, maybe 3 old lilacs, probably a century old, and 5 old apple trees. This is the real stunner of the group. This is probably about 140 to 150 years old, this tree. It's about 40 feet across and about 30 feet tall. Still blooms, still makes apples. When I first saw it, it was covered with invasives, multiflora rose, bittersweet, et cetera, and everybody said, cut them down, these old apples, too much work, too much trouble. How could you cut this down? I mean, this is just this incredible creature, this wonderful old creature. So I have spent a lot of time keeping these apples opened up and happy, and hopefully they'll live another 150 years. They've become the most wonderful place before they leaf out to have like little ephemerals, hellebores and trilliums and minor bulbs and all kinds of things tucked into their root systems. And then when the canopy leaves out, those things are in the shade the rest of the year, and that's how they like it. Now, one thing about this is you can't get instant gratification if you want to make a garden under old trees like this, because you have to work with like a hori-hori knife or a tablespoon, really small plants, really tiny divisions or seed things in. You can't dig with a shovel under a venerable old tree like this. So this was a long process to get here, but now these are my favorite places in March and April, especially under the old apple trees. Paige kind of alluded to this when she showed us looking out at that garden that she can see, as she said, even when she and her husband Bosco are inside eating or whatever, that you can see the butterflies right there. It's really important to me. As she also said earlier, I said that, quoting her, we're dirt gardeners. Like when we can be outside, we want to be outside, but we're doing chores. We're not lying around on the patio chaise lounge or something. You know, we're crawling around and working mostly. So when I get to admire the garden is from inside out. So to me, making axial views, painting pictures on axis from the windows, in this case, my bedroom, where I use the house the most and get to turn around and look, you know, outside where I plug in the tea kettle every morning and make my breakfast and I'm staring out the window half awake. I want beautiful views out those windows. So to me, everything from the shapes of the beds to the plantings, there's a couple of the apples in the distance there on the right and on the far left, in bloom at lilac time. And there's one of those pools. I mentioned how important they've been to the garden. And again, I didn't know much 35 years ago. When I came here, I didn't know much about anything. But this was the best investment I made, was digging these holes and lining them with, with thick rubber and keeping them unfrozen all the winters since, with floating pond heaters and so forth. I cover them with floating plants, as you can see, during the active season, so that the string algae and so forth doesn't get enough light to really thrive, so that I don't have to use any nasty chemicals or anything like that. And I never clean out the water. I never empty them or do anything like that, because these are real habitats. And to get the water chemistry favorable to all those amphibians and so forth that I talked about before briefly, you don't want to be tinkering with it. You want it to be natural. So this is one of my favorite places. And this also is on axial view from the place where I sit a lot of the time in the house and eat and look out straight out the window. Is I see this all the time, 365 days a year. So it was positioned unconsciously, but it was positioned really well to be enjoyed every day on axis from a key window. As I said in the beginning, we were both sort of plant collectors, and this was kind of the kind of things. I'm a leaf person, not a flower person. Paige is much more of a accomplished flower gardener. And I mostly am into leaves because you get so many months out of them, you clean them up once or maybe twice a year and they just look good the rest of the time until the winter. So these are the kinds of plants and the kinds of plantings that are still around the house. So the outer areas of the house, and we'll see a little bit of that later, are a little more loose and so forth. But this is sort of one of the remnants leading right up the path, right up to the front door of a collector's garden. And the kind of leaves I like the most are really big leaves. This is one of the first perennials I ever bought at a botanic garden sale, actually, probably 30 years ago, Astilboides tabularis in the shade. So the bigger the better for me with leaves, but leaves over flowers any day. Don't tell the insects, all the pollinators and so forth that I said that. So Paige, now that we sort of,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was going to say, what are you dreaming of doing? Like we promised we were going to talk a little bit about what we had in mind for the year ahead.
Dreams.
Yeah, you're like, I think we're both into the unmowing phase of our lives, right?
Yes, Margaret and I were talking about unmowing. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. When we came to what we call Church House, this place in Falls Village, there was a field in the front of the house, and there was a small field in the back of this. This is the back of the house. And every year I make this field bigger. Every year I think I need less grass. I figure I need enough grass for my grandchildren to play badminton, and maybe one of my grandchildren someday getting married on a stretch of glass. But I'm rather thrilled with not only the look of fields or meadows, if you want to call them that, but also that the life that they give your property and your garden. I should say, because you're seeing little apple trees here that I've planted with cedar not supports, but kind of cages around us. We, unlike Margaret's place or Duck Hill, our old place, both of those were Margaret's place, I believe, is deer fenced.
Yes.
And so is Duck Hill. This is not. We are not deer fenced. So we have to think about that, where we have anything that the deer like. And so my John and I made these cages kind of around these little trees, and then below the top rail you'll see well, you don't see it, but there are 3 strands of wire, and it does keep the deer from eating those little apple trees. Can I have that next slide? I'm going to show you another slide of flowers. In the backfield, we are so lucky, without any planting, doing anything on my part. We have a lot of native flowers. The front field, not so much, but because our soil is poor and sandy and dry, and perhaps because it's limey, little blue stem seems to love it. And this is a picture of little blue stem, our native grass. It's a native grass that likes it high and dry. And it turns the most beautiful colors in the fall, and even in the winter. Right now it's covered with a foot or plus snow, but when it's not covered with a foot of snow, it's this wheat color. And when the sun hits it, it just takes your breath away. And John and I do a certain amount of pulling invasives in the fields. And every time we clear a little area, it seems that little bloom stem comes in. And the grasses are just such a special part of these fields. Can we have the next slide? Well, this is the back field, and it's just full of native flowers. We have a lobelia I never heard of before called Lobelia spicata. We have an anemone called thimbleweed. We have these black-eyed Susans and fleabane, and the wonderful bergamot, that wonderful monarda that you see so much in our area, and I'm sure in Margaret's area too. It just paints fields kind of a lavender, a mauvey lavender in July. So these fields, if I'm inside looking out the window, working in the garden, like in the cutting garden, or taking a walk, because we have paths through all of this meadow area. I am, the fields just animate my days. They're the movement, the life they afford. It's just a real thrill. And I think that's the last slide, isn't it?
Yeah.
I should say one thing about mowing.
Mhm.
We mow the fields in early, as soon as it's dry enough in early spring. We leave them up. We leave the fields up in the winter for two reasons: because they're beautiful. The seed heads of the grasses and the flowers are beautiful, especially in snow, but also because they provide food for the birds, and they also provide hiding places for good bugs. Right, Margaret?
Yes, and Doug Tallamy, the famous Doug Tallamy, and a lot of other ecologists and so forth really advocate that when we do unmow or plant a meadow or a field to promote diversity, that we let it be that habitat even in the off season for overwintering beneficials, all the arthropods, insects, yes, but also like so many spider species, so many beetles, so many creatures that are really needed in the habitat, that crawl under leaves or crawl under, dried up plants and spend the winter. And if we mow too soon in the spring, before at least several days or even a week of 50-degree days, a lot of the experts say, which gives the cue to all those creatures to wake up and go about their business and go on to the next place. If we do that, then we're just grinding them up. Similarly to the way in the fall, if we clean up our leaves with a leaf shredder or mow over all our leaves and don't let, especially under our native oaks and maples and so forth, some of the leaves just lie where all these creatures again are going to overwinter, we're really diminishing the next generation of all these beneficials. So timing of mowing is super important when we manage a field. I always say that the birds taught me to garden, because when I first came here, I was a girl from Queens. I'd gone to college in New York City. I knew some birds, but I didn't know the birds that were here. And I would see all these birds as I would be out starting making gardens and stuff. This is just a young rose-breasted grosbeak out in the backyard. Very gregarious, fun birds. But I started to kind of observe their behavior, and I would research. There was no internet then, looking up their diets, their nesting habits, and it really gradually moved me to a more native focus. They really took me there, the birds did. So they also took me eventually to learning about moths, which are my current obsession. I identified and photographed about 200 species so far on the property. There are probably 1,200 species in my county, so I have a long way to go. But I just show this to you for a second to say, don't forget that the garden, there's a whole night shift in your garden. And I spent the first probably 25, 28 years of my gardening career, almost 30 years of my gardening career, never thinking about what goes on after dark out there. And it's amazing. The diversity is amazing. So get a CFL black light for $7.99 and one of those clip-on lamp holders, and plug it in on your back porch and put up a white sheet and spend some summer nights outside seeing who shows up, because it might be some of these guys that I photographed at my place. So the birds taught me to garden. they led me to other creatures, like especially moths, and butterflies are more obvious but less diverse. We have many, many fewer species of butterflies. So my unmowing experiment started above the house. You've seen this spot before, both looking down in an earlier picture and looking up in the snow. And this was the first sort of unmowing experiment I did. I also discovered that when I unmowed, and we say unmow, meaning literally that, as opposed to planting a meadow, sort of seeing what comes up and then editing. And I found that little blue stem came up. It's a warm season grass. That means that it needs, if we want to favor the little blue stem, we need to time our mowing after the cool season weeds come up a few weeks earlier. They may start growing like in April. And so I mow once about the end of the first week in May, just as the blue stem, which is waking up later than its competitors, begins to poke through. So I mow, leaving the blue stem just emerging and knocking the heads off all its competitors and giving it the advantage. This island is much bigger than in this picture. This was a number of years ago, but goldenrods, I have 6 species of goldenrods have shown up, several species of asters that I never had seen anywhere else on the property, just by unmowing, and lots of other things as well. So that's my little unmowing story. One of the things that's hard, and I was just saying editing out, and Paige mentioned editing out some of the unwanted things that do show up. Unwanted things show up all over the place, don't they, Paige?
Yes, they do.
So,
So this is a picture of what the part of the low woods looked like when we came here 6 years ago. And what you're looking at is a shrub, honeysuckle, that is invasive. It's called Lonicera mororii, and bittersweet and buckthorn. And my beloved John, once a week, we actually spend most of the year, most of the work that John does and that I help him with is clearing the woods of invasives and also making paths and nurturing the natives that are there. So this is a before picture, and the next picture is pretty much the same area. And what you're seeing here in the distance are 2 native understory shrubs. One is our native witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, which I have a love affair with. And the other is something that grows in calcareous, in limey woodland, and it's called prickly ash. And it is prickly, and it's sometimes called the toothache tree. It's the northernmost species of the citrus family. What was I going to say? Oh, I know. Its claim to fame, as far as I'm concerned, is it's the preferred food for the larvae of that giant black swallowtail butterfly.
mm-hmm.
And consequently, we have so many of those butterflies in the summer. So, and it turns a lovely yellow color in the fall. So I have nothing bad to say about prickly ash. Because John and I were, mostly John, cutting down all these invasives and sometimes pulling them up, but mostly cutting them down and limbing up some things and so on, we ended up with a lot of brush. And we're down in the deep woods. We didn't have a chipper. We couldn't drag it out. So I suggested to John that we make brush piles. And he makes them rather nicely. And I think of them as land art. But they're also habitats,
Right.
Probably for the rabbits that are eating my garden. Never had rabbit trouble before. But also for all sorts of wonderful critters. The next slide. Like this little chipping sparrow. And it's a place for birds to go and not only nest, but escape, maybe a hawk or an owl, or so I love the fact that we're actually using everything. That appeals to me. The one real headache we have is bittersweet. I'll never be able to lick. I'll never be able to get rid of it all.
I'm
But
showing you my one handful of my seedlings of bittersweet. I'm bumping. Because I knew you were going to say bittersweet, so I wanted to show you my mandala of bittersweet seedlings. This is just literally, I must pull out 5,000 a year
Yeah.
easily, and I never get ahead of it.
no, it is. I mean, the important thing is to get it off the trees, out of the
Yeah.
shrubs, get it out of everything. And it's the one time that John and I are not organic, in that I have a little bottle, and it's so little I can put it in my back pocket, and it has a sponge on top, and I put a little Roundup in there. And in August and September, when the energy of bittersweet or any plant is going back down, we cut the bigger pieces of bittersweet, we cut them to the ground, and we brush that cut stem with Roundup.
Right, as opposed to spraying a quart or a gallon or 10 gallons, you're using
Never
a
dream of doing
quarter
that.
of a teaspoon on a cut spot. Yeah.
But and actually, as we get rid of the invasives, I see the natives, things like gray dogwood and nannyberry and
Yes.
the little oaks and so on, just taking breath and saying,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
So I'm pulling out bittersweet. That's one of my full-time jobs. One thing that I don't want to see us pull out or pull down so much anymore, again, in the name of diversity, the way we manage trees, dead and dying trees, is so destructive to habitat. This was a double-trunked, very, very old birch. It started dying from the top down. And I had the wobbly parts taken off and left it as a snag or wildlife tree. And look at the hollows in it. And this is so much biomass, so much food for so many animals, potentially, so many hiding spaces and perches and lookouts for so many animals, and so many microorganisms that are actually living within it. So it's just deteriorating here in place. It will fall, its carcass will degrade into the soil from whence it grew up. So even leaving a high stump if we can, and I'm not talking about where it's a danger to people or buildings or anything, but where we can, we need to cultivate snags, not take down and erase trees, dead and dying trees. Again, as long as safety is not a concern, this is a super important thing that we can change our habits. The thing that I am removing besides bittersweet is a lot of the ground covers I planted when I first got here. Again, European or Asian plants like Lamiastrum galliobdulin or yellow archangel, or sometimes called Lamium galliobdulin. Showy ground cover, but a total thug. Moving into the woods probably will probably have expanded all the way over to Paige's house before long from my house. It's so thuggish as it gets older. And so I'm taking out spring, fall, and the following spring, or fall, spring, fall. Usually it's taking 3 times, digging each area, large areas of ground cover 3 times before I feel good enough that I've gotten rid of enough of it that I can start to plug in native plugs like native ginger, the Asarum canadense, and native ferns and tiarella and things like that into these large spaces. So one of the things I'm doing to get rid of what were formerly collector plants is I'm eliminating some of the invasive non-native ground covers. It's a slow process. You can't put these in the compost. They will resprout. You really have to have a burn pile. But it's worth it. And I'm kind of excited. So that's on my dream list for this year, is I'm going to be continuing. And in my first area that I started a year and a half ago, I'm going to be able to start planting some native plugs. Some of the non-native ground covers is Geranium macrorhizum.
Love it.
Yeah, I love it. And the thing is, it doesn't seed around. It's not going into the woods or whatever. It's not diverse. It's not native insect habitat. It didn't co-evolve because it's from a different country with our native insects and animals, but it stays where you put it. And it means that I, especially as a 60-something-year-old person, have large areas under shrubs and trees that I don't have to weed because it's a weed suppressing living mulch. So I'm not taking out all my non-native ground covers, I will confess.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
agree.
yeah. So in the name of time, Paige, because we're already at like 13 of,
Yep.
I wanted to ask you about kind of what's brightening your days at the moment.
I can tell you in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
We have cold frames here, and I like to force bulbs. And if anybody wants to know more about it, you can ask me or read my book. But right now, I'm just starting to pull out the first ones, and this is an Iris reticulata and a little species crocus, and I just have them on the windowsill, and they give me such joy. And you can just flip through the rest of those.
The cold frames are so great, Paige. I'm so jealous.
Yeah, I kind of love them, and right now pots of bulbs are buried in them with those. And the next one, and this is just a little, it's a daffodil called Little Jam, but isn't that sweet?
Yeah. And you've been doing this for a long time, and you pot these up in the fall and then sort of submerge them in some sort of mulch.
They stay out in the cold frames for 12 to 14 weeks.
Right.
And then I start to bring them in.
Right.
So it's fun. It's really fun.
Yeah. So speaking of something that likes cold, not quite as much cold as the forcing bulbs, but for me, my ritual as the season winds down
Gorgeous.
is that the Clivias, the big old Clivias, of which I have many, have to go into a really cold space and be dry. So from, I don't know, around November, December into part of January, maybe for like 8-10 weeks I do it. I keep them from under 50, like 40 to 50 degrees in a bright spot because they're evergreen. These are house plants, quote unquote. They spend their summers outdoor in the semi-shade. But they need to have that cold, dry trigger to create flower spikes. And so I do that, as I said, until sometime in January from fall. No water at all. Some people give them a little water because they feel sorry for them. And then you bring them into like 60 degrees in January-ish or so, or even right now if you didn't already. And in March, they'll bloom for you if all goes well. But it's that giving them that dormancy, that forced dormancy that's cold and dry. And then again, like 10 or so weeks later, giving them a period of starting to water them again and warming them up again.
And
so
then do you fertilize them when you wake them up?
Do I what?
When you wake them up, do you fertilize them?
Should I? Yes. No, actually you should fertilize them after flowering, but I don't feed anything ever anywhere, indoors or outdoors. I'm a horrible person. But it looks pretty happy, doesn't it? This plant is about 4 feet across, so it's a pretty happy plant.
Absolutely fabulous.
So that's the end of the slides, and I think we should, I'm gonna stop sharing if I can figure it out. Where's my stop sharing? Stop share, there we go. And I'm gonna, I think that someone who's administering is gonna set us up as gallery view so that people can see us as we answer questions. Oh my goodness, so let's see, I'm gonna see where the questions began. Yay, I see someone, Rhonda says, yay, love Cyadopetus. Have you she's managed to keep it alive in Salt Lake City. Good for you. It's one of the great conifers. And what am I trying to say? Oh God, what's wrong with me? Ginkgo. It's the only species in its genus. You know, it's monotypic, the word for that, right, Paige? Isn't that the word, monotypic? It's the only Cyadopodus species there is, verticillata, so good for you. Someone's asking if I spray the apples, and do you spray your apples? I've never sprayed mine.
No.
Yeah.
I see a question, sources for plugs of native plants. I don't know where this person, Kathy Purdy, I don't know where you live, but there's a wonderful native nursery near here called Earth Tones. All they have is native perennials, shrubs and trees. And I just love going there. And also the New England Wildflower Society, which is now called the Plant Trust.
Right.
They have a place it's about 2 hours drive from here up in Massachusetts called, what is it called?
Nasami Farm.
Nasami Farm. And that's another wonderful place to go and get natives, especially for your woodland.
Right.
So anyway, 2 places.
So I'm not sure where that, I haven't gotten that far yet to Kathy Purdy's question. Let's see, so.
I wasn't at the top, I see that.
Okay, so someone asked about in the slide with the Japanese forest grass, what was the round leaf shiny plant in front? And that's European ginger. That's another Asarum. We have a native one that's not shiny and round leaf or as round. And this is Asarum europaeum. It's a fun little perennial from Europe, as its name sounds. And the name of the big leaf plant is Astilboides, Astilboides, Astilboides. So Kathy's asking more about methods we use to get rid of invasives. We talked a little bit about some of ours. I'm more of a repeat digger kind of person, and I also then sometimes solarize if I have enough light in a space, but in the deep shady areas, solarize meaning using clear thick plastic over an area and kind of cooking things to death for a while.
Another thing we do in the field, we have a little, not too big a patch of mugwort, that horrible Artemisia that you see on the sides of the road.
Right.
It's not something you want to take over your field, that's for sure. But we weed whack it down to the ground. It's just not a very big patch, and maybe 3 times a summer we weed whack it down to the ground. And I don't think digging it up works very well, but anyway, we seem to have stopped it from spreading.
Right.
And I live with that. And other plants that are fine are starting to creep in. So that's another thing. Just
Sherry's asking about perennial beds becoming too much to maintain, and to make beds easier to take care of, how to kind of do that.
shrubs. Shrubs.
Right, shrubs are a lot easier than labor intensive than perennials for sure.
Get rid of the perennials that take the most attention, staking, deadheading, whatever, that you can live without, and put flowering shrubs in their place. Shrubs take almost no, once you've planted them, they take almost no time at all compared to perennials and annuals.
And there's another question about mowing the field. I think we did get to that, about the timing, depending on what your desired plant is that you're trying to support.
Yeah, your idea was good. The one place where we mow in November is under the apple trees, because I have daffodils there, narcissus there. We're trying to have great sweeps of them. And so we mow it in November so that the grass is low when the daffodils come up.
Right. A question about, in apartments, a small patio, are there native, I believe it's for shade plants, that could be grown in containers? And it depends on how big the containers are, because when you bring something above ground, it doesn't have the thermal benefit of the in-ground insulation. You're like bringing it into 1 zone colder, at least. Some people say 1.5 zones colder by growing it in containers. So if you're in zone 6, you'd be in zone 5, or, the plants would be in zone 5 kind of thing. So it'd have to be bone hardy stuff. And I'd say really lusty stuff like some of the ferns and some of the bone hardy ferns. I think the native ginger is really lusty.
Or how about the heuchera, heuchera that's native, which I love, that blooms in the fall.
Like
Just has
Velosa, the Americana or
Velosa,
Velosa.
Velosa. And I mean, that could be combined with a lovely grass like one of the Japanese forest grasses, or a sedge, a beautiful sedge like the Pennsylvania sedge. If you wanted something kind of woodlandy looking, could be.
Yeah, I would just be really mindful that small containers are very uninsulated. So
Right.
big containers, hence the whiskey barrels that were so popular, not attractive, but that kind of volume, you're going to be able to have a lot more liberty to grow perennials that'll overwinter well. Someone's asking if I stock fish in my ponds. 30 years ago, whatever, I did have fish. Maybe 15, 10 or maybe 10 years ago, some raccoons finally ate the last of the fish. I mostly like the frogs and the salamanders, so I'm fine without the fish. I did for a little while have them.
The geranium.
Yeah. The geranium.
The geranium you used as a ground cover, and
Oh, macrorhizum, which means macrorhizum, big root, the big root geranium.
And it's also used for perfume. It's very scented.
Like herbal smelling, spicy. Another about the sources for native plants, there is a place called Izel, I-Z-E-L plants, that's been trying to aggregate from various producers of liners and sell retail liners. But one thing that I do is that I ask the local nursery, who can order wholesale from places like North Creek Nurseries, the great liner grower. I say to them, buy it, mark it up, and sell it to me. In other words, don't repot it. Just tell me whatever the markup is. So go to your nursery and say to them, do you have an account at North Creek Nurseries or another liner grower? If you get it for $70 a tray, will you sell it to me for $100 a tray? They don't have to do anything to it, right? So I think we need to talk to our nurseries, our local nurseries, about helping us get liners too.
This one
woman you mentioned, sorry.
This one woman says, can I see your cold frames one more time? Well, if you buy my book, I have a whole chapter on the cold frames and pictures. And
if you remind me, I'll put the thing back on for 1 second at the end. But okay, the species rose, what was it again?
Well, that was the apple rose is called Rosa villosa, Villosa.
Okay.
And I also have the Father Hugo rose and quite a few others around the garden. You have to come.
And the name of the butterfly in the rocky hill.
Is the endangered northern meadowlark butterfly. It's a very small, pretty brown butterfly. And when it hatches, what it likes to eat is black-eyed Susans. So it's kind of fun.
So you're set.
I'm set. Yes.
You're all set. So we have a question. I have a question about when unmowing, do we get a lot of bad things coming in, at least early on? And the answer is yes. And the tricky part about weeding them out, like we would in a garden bed, is that we leave a little bit of bare soil where the root came up. And that is like a field day for more weeds. So we have to either put some old leaves or some mulch right on top of that so that there's no light to let the seed bed of more weeds sprout in that spot, or immediately put a division of something there that is wanted. You can't just pull them out and walk away, because you'll make a bigger problem. I have, unfortunately, blackberries, some kind of, rubus, woody things up above. And so I have to really keep after those. That's hard. And I'm actually getting poison ivy up there too, which is a great native plant, but I don't like it being in there.
No.
So that's a tricky one. And I dig it and bag it and just, put it in the garbage. But you have to be brave. do that. But yeah.
I see a couple of fig.
Yeah, do you bring your figs inside?
Yes, we have it's actually my husband, and the figs are his thing, and he brings them in for the winter, and they're in a garage that doesn't go to freezing. It stays around 40 degrees, and actually because he has a little heater in the garage, and that's where we have the figs, that's where we have the dahlias, anything that wants to go to sleep in the winter, but then is going to wake up in the spring. That's and you don't want the figs to be somewhere warm in the wintertime, but come March he'll start to water them and give them some sunlight.
Right.
And then as soon as we're pretty sure there isn't going to be a bad frost, we wheel them out onto the terrace. So yeah.
The name of the farm in Massachusetts for the natives again, can you tell us that again? Didn't you have
the farm, Earth Tones?
Earth Tones?
It's actually in Woodbury, Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
Not in Massachusetts.
Okay, Woodbury, Connecticut. Okay.
Yeah.
Neither of us, someone's asking about unmowing and starting native areas after construction in muddy clay soil. I don't think either one of us has a very heavy, super heavy soil. I don't have much. I can't offer any firsthand.
I love that I don't have clay soil. Although lots of things love clay soil, but it's so hard to work in.
Yeah.
No, sandy, limey, and where we had the construction and where I now am not mowing, I have put in some plugs of things like a butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, that I know is just going to love the poorness of the soil. And I've scattered some seed of some asters that I like. So anyway.
Right. So deer, people are asking about deer, of course, and deer resistant perennials and deer things. And I'm a real advocate of fencing or barriers of some kind. I wouldn't waste a lot of money on sprays unless you're in a very low pressure area.
However, in the woods, we have dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of oak saplings, and deer like to eat oak saplings. And I have some stuff in a spray bottle called Deer Defeat. It's totally organic, but it smells like crazy. And once a month I go and I spray those baby oaks, and it pretty much keeps the deer away.
Right, but and that, yes, but they have lots else to eat at your place. So if you're in a whole garden and the whole thing is unfenced and you have a big perennial border or whatever, do you know what I mean? It just, yeah, so it's tricky. I didn't want to fence. I didn't fence the first 10 years, but I'm glad that I did. One of the things that I had seen in California, which I ended up using sort of along the front road here, an adaptation of it, a really wonderful gardener who wrote a bunch of books, Betsy Klebsch. She had a beautiful garden and terrible deer pressure, and she didn't want to have a big monstrous fence, and like a prison, and she had 2 4-foot fences parallel to each other, like a double fence, about 4 or 5 feet apart. She planted like herbs and other things in between the 2 fences. And then her garden was fenced, but there wasn't a tall fence anywhere. 2 low fences. And again, you can use the area in between. The deer won't jump in.
They don't
it doesn't have to look so awful. So I think being creative with fencing is another.
I have to say, I have a border right along the driveway. I know the deer go there. And I have in it baptisias, Russian sage, Amsonias, things like that, some peonies and asters. And the deer don't seem to like those things. Anyway, they don't bother that border, which is really nice.
Naming some shade shrubs. I like a lot of I have a lot of bottlebrush buckeye, which is a southeastern plant. A native southeastern plant is the only place it's still native in this country. However, before the last ice age, it may have been up here, like Fothergilla and other things that are now only in the southeast, still extant in the southeast. Who knows? But it's a big, big shrub. I love the Fothergillas. I grow those in sort of semi-shade. I mean,
do you grow plethora?
Plethora, lindera, the spice bush. The native spice bush has fabulous fall color. Some of the earliest flowers for pollinators of any of our native shrubs, and fruit for small mammals as well. The spice bush, lindera, benzoin. Lots of possibilities, I guess, for shady conditions. But I'm more getting into more of the native ones. So a lot of the native viburnums in our northeastern native viburnums, like the maple leaf viburnum and so forth, are things of the woodlands or the woodland edge. Let's see. Favorite native that's valuable to wildlife and easy to care for. For me, winterberry hollies. I have about 50 mature winterberry hollies along the edge of the place. And I don't really do anything to them except watch the birds come in by the hundreds to eat the fruit in the fall.
The deer do like them.
Right.
I have to protect the winterberries, although they grow in our little wetland, which is wonderful. But I was going to say something. Oh, just gone out of my mind.
Well, while you're thinking, what are your fig varieties? Do you know?
One is brown turkey, and I don't know what the other one is.
Okay, maybe like Chicago extra hardy, probably. Yeah. And there's another question about watering them. They're dormant. They don't need water in the winter. So that's true of all things that are deciduous, leafless, and in storage, so to speak. They don't need light, they have no leaves, and they don't need water because they're not photosynthesizing. You don't want to let it go too long and desiccate them, but yeah.
We have a pot of lemon verbena, which I just love because I love it. I love the way it smells, and I love it in tea. But it goes dormant. It's twiggy, it's woody, and it goes dormant. And then we start watering it in March.
Patricia has a great suggestion, and we'll just wind down in the next 2-3 minutes here. But Patricia has a great suggestion. She says, which I'm jealous of, my tall fence will soon be invisible due to the wild vines, Virginia creeper, wild grape, native clematis, etc. It's 11-year-old, a field fence from Tractor Supply, metal, and yet it's invisible, and it's like a wall of native attracting wonderfulness. So that's great. I'm a big lover of Virginia creeper. Everyone thinks it's a weed, but it's a super.
I'm growing it. I'm growing it in our chimney.
Yeah.
Love it.
So, I apologize if we missed some of the questions. I think we did pretty well. We tried, and we were gonna look at the cold frames really quickly. Is that? Should I really do that? Share screen if I could find it again. I think it's just.
Margaret, if you can't find it, we have recorded this, so you can go to the library website a couple of days.
There they are.
Yeah, so that's a little look at the cold frames, and then I'll unshare my screen in a second, if that was helpful to people. And Paige, I'm coming over to measure them and rip off your design.
They're fun for all kinds of things.
Yeah, so, well, thank you, Kathleen, for having us.
Thank you. You guys are amazing. You are so inspirational, and I can't wait for spring. And I'm sure everyone out there feels the same way.
Please,
And
please.
when COVID is over, when the pandemic is behind us, come visit our gardens.
Yes.
Are we
Yeah.
having open days this year?
We
No,
don't,
We
Right.
don't know.
probably, don't know. Don't know.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, ladies. You were
Thank
wonderful.
you.
All right.
Everyone's